The first betrayal was written in ink and notarized. It waited in a manila folder that smelled like old leather and dust, and when the words were read aloud, they stripped the air from my lungs more cleanly than any slap. My husband's voice, borrowed by a lawyer, told me I would inherit a rotting cabin in the Green Mountains, while my son, my only son, would take our Burlington home. The investments we had tended for decades, and $9 million. Grief has a weight, but humiliation has edges, and I felt every one of them. I had believed the will would be a formality after 30 years of marriage marked by careful frugality, patched gutters, and summers spent coaxing tomatoes from soil. The office of Morrison and Tate creaked with the history of other families' endings. I never imagined mine would be rewritten there. Beside me sat Damien, 33, Boston polished, his tie a small flag of triumph he hadn't yet earned. When Mr. Morrison finished reading, I searched for the mistake that wasn't coming. "No mistake, Mother?" Damien said, and he made the word sound like a thing you scrape from your shoe. The April sun threw rectangles of cold light over dead fern fronds as we walked to the cars, and his heels ticked out a happy metronome across the lot. I drove home to a house that had been mine by devotion, if not by deed, and, by the next morning, belonged to him by both. I had washed those floors on my knees through flu seasons and exam weeks, and the walls held the soft scuffs of growth charts and framed diplomas. Now, Damien stood in the living room as if measuring it for his future. "You'll need to be out by next week," he said softly, the way men ask for a glass of water. I kept my teacup steady and discovered the first battlefield would be dignity, not the porcelain set my mother left me, not the quilt I stitched the year he was born, but the simple refusal to beg. I folded clothes into 2 suitcases. He watched from doorways, calling certain objects estate property, slicing my life into what could stay and what would replace me. On the 7th morning, I loaded my car. "Try not to embarrass yourself out there," he added, without looking up from his phone. The driveway had never felt longer. I drove toward the hills. Time unspooled differently on Pine Creek Road. Asphalt gave way to gravel, gravel to dirt, and spring had only just begun sketching green into the maples. The cabin's roof sagged as though it had been listening too long for a kindness that never arrived. One window gaped like a missing tooth. Inside, dust lifted in slow galaxies. There was no electricity, no plumbing, only a rusted stove and a mattress that had surrendered to mice. I laid an old blanket on the floor and stared through a hole in the roof at a sky more honest than any attorney. I had traded central heating for the sound of wind in boards and, for the first time since Robert's funeral, I wept until the silence took my voice and softened it. Grief recedes in serviceable inches. Mornings became sweeping and patching, a rhythm of small, stubborn repairs, a crack stuffed with rags, a bucket filled from the creek, a loose hinge coaxed into obedience. The work steadied me, but the telephone's stillness did not. Word traveled faster than thaw. Neighbors repeated Damien's story that I'd made a scene at the lawyer's office, clawing at papers, that I'd become greedy, crazed by money that was never mine. Even family let the lie fit them like a new coat. Invitations evaporated. When the phone did ring, the voices were careful, tamped down by a shared concern that I might embarrass them further. Exile, I learned, is not a place on a map. It is the room left after reputation has been emptied of furniture. I kept moving. The porch had become my daily truce with despair, a place where wood met nail with a clean, answering sound. On an afternoon that looked like a promise, but smelled like cold mud. I pried up a warped plank and felt my crowbar catch on something metallic. Not a nail larger, unwilling. It popped free into my palm, a heavy brass key etched with markings that weren't letters so much as the memory of them. The metal held a kind of deliberateness that made my skin prickle. The cabin, I realized, was a language I had never learned to read. Lantern in hand, I descended to the cellar. The air was damp, the stone walls patched like the knees of a child's jeans. Cobwebs drooped in old lace curtains. I swept the light along the far wall and found, half shaded by a listing shelf, a square outline I had never noticed. I dragged the shelf aside and stared at a small metal door. No larger than a bread box, its lock etched with those same stubborn marks. My heart, by then a patient organ, had forgotten how to race. It remembered quickly. The key slid in and turned with a clean, intimate click, and the door folded open to reveal a narrow cavity holding a manila envelope tied with twine and a tin box the size of a prayer. Upstairs, at the scarred table that had become my office, I set both objects down. I touched the twine. I touched the lid. The wind nudged the cabin in its joints like an old friend, asking if I was ready to hear what came next. The April light thinned toward evening, and for a moment I simply let the weight of the key rest in my palm. I had lost a home and been given a ruin. Now the ruin was speaking. I lifted the lid. Inside the tin box lay a letter, folded with the precision of someone who knew the weight it would someday carry. The handwriting was Robert's steady, familiar. A script that had filled shopping lists and birthday cards, and now reached me across the boundary of death. My dearest Evelyn, it began. If you are reading this, then the decision I made has wounded you. I left you the cabin not to punish, but to protect. Damien inherited the house and the money because I knew he would squander them. What he could not squander was the land beneath your feet. The mineral rights belong to you alone. Trust yourself. I always did. The words blurred through tears. I untied the envelope with trembling hands and spread its contents across the table. Survey maps, deeds, mineral reports, official seals and signatures, confirming Robert's claim to 200 acres of Pine Creek Valley. Some pages bore his annotations in the margins, notes I recognized from the years he had worked in forestry. A quiet picture formed while I had scrubbed floors and paid bills. He had quietly secured something invisible and vast. The cabin was no ruin. It was the lockbox to a fortune buried beneath the earth. I carried the papers to an attorney in Montpelier, a man recommended by an old friend. His office smelled of cedar and ink, the kind of place where truth had to stand taller than lies. He adjusted his glasses as he read. "These deeds are airtight, Mrs. Calloway," he said, "filed in your name, separate from the estate. Your son cannot contest them." The words slid into me like warm light. For months I had felt like a ghost, erased by the lies Damien told. Now here was proof that Robert had trusted me, not abandoned me. At the lawyer's urging, I hired a geologist. Dr. Martin Reeves arrived in muddy boots, with equipment clattering like stubborn bells. For 3 days he walked the valley, scraping samples, listening to the ridges as if they spoke a language only he understood. When he handed me his report, his eyes gleamed. "Beneath your property lie deposits of high-quality quartz, significant seams of amethyst, and most promising of all, green tourmaline. Conservatively valued at between $10 and $15 million. I stared at the number, written plainly in his neat hand, 10 to 15 million. Robert's faith unfolded before me in ink and mineral dust. He had known Damien's fortune would vanish like snow on spring roads, and he had prepared me for a longer winter. The irony was Sharp, my son, who had once accused me of contributing nothing, was now drowning in luxury he could not sustain, while I, the cast-off widow, held wealth so deep it hummed beneath the soil. Word of Damien reached me like whispers through broken windows. Neighbors spoke of his new Porsche gleaming on the driveway, the parties that emptied bottles until dawn, the women whose laughter spilled from restaurants I had never entered. Social media flaunted his trips to Paris and Madrid, a glittering parade bought with inherited gold. But in town, I overheard another kind of story loan request denied. Mortgages taken against his inheritance. By autumn, Martha Henderson told me he already owed more than $200,000. The boy who had exiled me was burning faster than firewood in January. I returned to my cabin with the geologist's report folded in my pocket. Outside, the maples were spilling red leaves onto the dirt road. Inside, I laid the papers beside Robert's letter. The cabin had once seemed like a tombstone for everything I had lost. Now it was the vault for everything I still had. Patience had been my companion all those lonely months, and now I understood why Robert had trusted it in me. The wealth beneath Pine Creek was not meant for reckless triumph. It was meant for endurance. The first snow arrived quietly, softening the sharp edges of exile. I chopped wood, hauled water, and waited. Each chore became a kind of prayer to resilience, and I told myself, Damien will come when the glitter cracks. He will come because he has nowhere else to go. One afternoon, as frost still clung to the grass, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the warped frame of the window, I saw a battered sedan inching up the drive. Gone was the Porsche. The man who stepped out wore a wrinkled shirt instead of tailored suits. His shoulders sagged as if gravity had finally noticed him. For a long moment, he stood staring at the cabin, not with scorn, but with something close to fear. Then he knocked, softer than I had ever heard. "Mother," he said when I opened the door. His voice was raw, stripped of its polish. "I need your help." I stood in the doorway, the cold air slipping between us, carrying the smell of rust and wet leaves. For months, I had rehearsed this moment in silence, shaping my anger into armor. Yet when Damien's eyes met mine, hollowed by desperation, the armor cracked. He was still my son, though he had banished me like a stranger. "You made it clear I was no longer your concern," I said, keeping my arms folded against the ache of remembering. His gaze faltered. "Things. They've gotten complicated. I owe $400,000. If I don't pay soon, I'll lose everything. My house, my career. Please, I'm begging you." His voice splintered, and I realized he had not begged for anything since he was a child with an inhaler clutched in his hand. A storm of feelings churned inside me. Rage at his cruelty, sorrow at his ruin, and beneath it, a spark of compassion I could not smother. I let him twist in silence until he lifted his head, eyes bright with fear. "Please, I'll do anything." "You will." My voice was steady, sharper than I felt. "I'll lend you what you need, but it will not be a gift. You will repay me with 5% interest over 10 years. Every Saturday, you will come here to work. Manual labor. No excuses. And you will write a letter of apology for the lies you spread read aloud at our next family gathering." His face blanched. Pride battled necessity. But necessity won. Shoulders sagging, he whispered, "I agree." At my kitchen table, with the sagging roof above us and Robert's letter tucked in the drawer, Damien signed the terms. His hands shook as if each stroke of ink peeled away an old arrogance. For the first time in years, the balance of power shifted, not with gloating, but with the quiet certainty of survival. The following Saturday, he returned in jeans and a faded sweatshirt, holding an axe like a man grasping an unfamiliar language. His palms blistered quickly, but he split logs while I stacked them, sweat running into his eyes. Week after week, he came back. He hauled brush, patched fences, scrubbed soot from the stove. The grumbling never disappeared, but the scorn did. Each blister was a lesson the world had tried to teach him and failed. Here, in the silence of Pine Creek, it took root. By December, snow lay in heavy folds on the cabin roof, but the air between us had thawed. We spoke little, yet the silence no longer felt like distance. He learned the patience of labor, and I learned the strange relief of watching him chip away at his own arrogance with every swing of the axe. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered at my sister's home in Montpelier. I had avoided these gatherings since Damien's lies painted me as greedy and unhinged. But that night, he stood before them, a folded paper trembling in his hand. His voice was unsteady. "I need to tell the truth. I lied about my mother. She never attacked anyone, never begged for money. I said those things to protect my pride, but all I did was destroy her reputation. She sacrificed everything for me, and I repaid her with cruelty." The room stilled. When he finished, silence lingered like a held breath. Then Sarah, my cousin who had once repeated his lies, crossed the room to take my hand. Others followed, apologies soft but sincere. For the first time since Robert's death, my dignity was restored not by wealth, not by hidden deeds, but by truth spoken aloud. As we left that night, Damien walked a step behind me, his shoulders no longer squared with triumph but bent with penitence. It was a start, not redemption, but the first honest step toward it. A year after the will had stripped me of everything. I stood on the porch of a farmhouse overlooking Lake Champlain. White clapboard walls gleamed in the morning sun, the wide porch stretching toward water that shimmered against the Adirondacks. This home was mine, built from the mineral rights Robert had entrusted me to guard. When Damien arrived in a modest sedan, his eyes widened at the sight. "Mother, how is this possible?" I poured tea, letting silence settle before I answered. "Do you remember the cabin you thought was punishment? Your father knew what he was doing. The land beneath it was worth more than everything he left you." His mouth opened, then closed. He lowered himself into a chair, smaller than I remembered. I continued gently. "You squandered $9 million in less than a year. I waited. I listened. I used what he entrusted wisely. This house is not just timber. It is proof that discipline outlives arrogance." For once, he dropped his gaze. No defiance remained, only the quiet realization of truth. And in that silence, I felt no need to gloat. The truth was enough. Looking out across the lake, I thought of Robert. He had known us both too well, Damien's hunger for easy triumph, my stubborn will to endure. Wealth, I realized, was never in the numbers. It lived in the strength to survive betrayal and rise again. That was the inheritance no one could take. Life's deepest fortunes are not measured in bank accounts or houses. They are measured in resilience, patience, and the quiet power of dignity reclaimed. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what lesson resonated most with you. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.